So in my paper, I trace the tension in Derrida's deconstruction of democracy between love and friendship, authority and autonomy, giving without receiving and forming agreements, responding to the other's finitude, and being responsible for the law. In his The Politics of Friendship, Derrida shows that the tension has intensified today since friendship, the object of politics, according to our tradition, cannot be conceptualized. With the loss of friendship, the finitude of the other comes to the foreground, which is why we can listen to the call of love more than ever. I will begin by showing how, in democracy, the singularity of the other is repressed in the name of equality, the law. I will continue by explaining why, for Derrida, the concept of friendship is empty today, and with it, the law, giving rise to enmity and Schmittian decisionism. Finally, I will argue that with the loss of friendship, with the impossibility of politics, citizens in a democracy are called to respond to the finitude of the other and decide to love, which uncovers the impossibility of equality, the law, and the possibility of a just decision. The singular as the enemy from within. The object of politics in a democracy is friendship, which entails a commonality or familiarity. But this immediately generates tension because each citizen in a democracy, a friend, is singular, whose death is the horizon of their experience. As finite, the singular can answer to the future in infinite ways, and therefore uncommon, unfamiliar. Moreover, plurality opens up time, as singular choose one another, because of their singularity, which is incalculable. Democracy transcends the singularity of the friend and the uncertainty it brings about by valuing equality. As Derrida notes, when people are equal, there is more sharing and reciprocity, leading to more laws and conventions among the citizens than tyranny. The friend, the singular, is the law's enemy from within, since it makes the object of politics, friendship, uncertain or unequal. The distinction between the friend and the enemy, and between identity, the one, and the other, finitude, is part of the foundation of Western thought. For example, Derrida argues, in Descartes' theory, which inaugurates modern philosophy, the enemy is the evil God who might corrupt thought with uncertainty, and therefore must be negated to justify reason, the friend. The subject constitutes itself by saying no to uncertainty about its object of thought, the enemy. But as Derrida also notes, that in democracy, the law cannot transcend singularity and completely negates its enemy from within, which is for him more unthinkable than tragedy, the impossibility of calculating the future. In a democracy, because the law is independent of all the singularities of the friends, it can ensure equal rights for all citizens, one of the most essential of which is the right to vote. However, the right to vote depends on the friend's singularity, which means that in democracy, there is irreconcilable tension between singularity and universality. Presupposing the meaning of friendship in democracy is an attempt to overcome the ultimate unthinkable. Since the law cannot calculate the singular, predict who the singular will be, it uses violence against it. In the same way that the Cartesian subject presupposes the object of thought, nature, democracy also presupposes the object of politics, friendship, as natural, meaningless. There's no more to it, which represses the singular and therefore limits the future. As Derrida argues, political freedom since antiquity is the freedom to die in the name of the Father or reason. The spirit of the dead that reminded the Greeks who they were and recalled the political truth. In this political condition, there's no chance to decide the undecided, the forgotten in the memory. When the meaning of life is natural or necessary, no one can make any decision, as everything seems to be decided, even before birth, including the law. Metaphysics of presence, of what Derrida calls throughout the book the tie between the natural and the lawful, is why Western traditional politics is marginalizing. The Cartesian subject violently negates out of fear any uncertainties about its given object of thought, nature, to be free, and the political law negates any uncertainty about its given object of politics, natural friendship. In our modern democratic tradition, for example, the object of friendship is fraternity, brotherhood, which the law transcends. Only brothers can be equal, as they have the same natural origin, the same mother. Therefore, politics in a democracy is exclusionary, misogynistic, and stagnated. But Derrida showed that democracy is open to meaning again, since not only it's no longer possible to trace friendship to nature, the familial, and marginalize women and ethnic groups, but it is impossible to conceptualize friendship, which is the possibility of responding to the finitude of the other. Metaphysical breakdown. For philosophers like Nietzsche, nature is uncertain, but it is something to celebrate, and it is promises creativity. My life is not an object I can reason about, because it is always more has more to come, a presence of absence, of difference that I cannot eliminate. If the meaning of life is no longer understood as natural and necessary, the law is neither, which means that the tie between the natural and the lawful, or the family and the state, has been released. Moreover, Nietzsche's genealogy showed that the uncertainty of life, of nature, was good rather than evil, which means that the hierarchy of friendship, certainty, and enmity, uncertainty, collapsed, amounting, according to Derrida, to losing the enemy, uncertainty, to be heard. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche traces the Christian inversion of master morality to slave morality, turning, quote, the friend into an enemy, the strong into the weak, the hegemonic into the oppressed. The Christian inversion is again a Western conversion, which involves negating finitude, alterity for autonomy. According to Nietzsche, the masters affirmed life or embraced the uncertainty of life, the non center, rather than crying for the loss of center, as Derrida explains in one of his early essays, Structure, Sign, and Play. At a later point, the Christian church turned the believers into the victims of life, which they had to negate in exchange for autonomy or immortality. The Christian faith eliminated the singularity of the other and therefore was oppressive. But with Nietzsche genealogy, we can say that freedom no longer necessarily means being autonomous, certain, or lawful, but quite the opposite, a political tool to master the common, slave morality. We can no longer conceptualize who is the subject of the law, the free friend, and who is the enemy, the source of uncertainty that threatens its identity, its freedom, which can explain why we feel lost, do not belong anywhere, and are conditioned to more and more violence. Since the law has no authority, it is not clear anymore who the law is supposed to represent, meaning who are the friends, and therefore everyone can be enemies. We can no longer theorize about politics and calculate the future, which is why each political actor is in a state of paranoia. The police used to have borders given by the law, but today, since the law is unfounded, there are no political territories. And if the law is unfounded, who has the right to live and who is grievable is in question. As Derrida argues, with the loss of the distinction between the enemy and the friend, we also lose our ability to use our concept to theorize about politics, leading to ambivalence. For example, it is impossible to distinguish between homicide, which is not political concept, and genocide, which is. What is a political crime? A crime against the political, such as terrorism, assassination, and torture, is unknown. Any political crimes are the same as other crimes. This loss of politics can explain why it is difficult today for the international community to try political offenses done to and by the state in court. The instrumentality of political theory. It is important to recognize that the breakdown of politics' theoretical foundation, i.e., the Western distinction between the friend and the enemy, became a dangerous political tool. Carl Schmitt, for example, used it to justify war in the concept of the political. For Schmitt, politics is unknown without an enemy, and the possibility of war, which Derrida argues can be traced back to Hegel, for whom without war history is unknown. According to Derrida, Schmitt acknowledges that we can no longer distinguish with war and peace due to the threat of nuclear and cold wars. Basically, Schmidt realized that the modern distinction and modern theory of politics is over. So he basically instrumentalized it. We are in a continuous state of war, and therefore, only by using the enemy and friend opposition, war and hence politics can have meaning. The sovereign has to know how to identify the friend and the enemy to survive politically. Without deciding who is the enemy, war, the condition for the possibility of the political, cannot be waged. As Derrida puts it, for Schmidt, war against the enemy is never a crime, but politics as such. Following Schmidt's rationale, Derrida argues that politicians today must invent an enemy to save the political, as in the Cold War and the War on Terror in the 2000s. One can also think of contemporary proxy wars, which align with what Derrida describes as the projection of alliance of enemies. Each political actor in the 21st century must have more than one enemy, even at the expense of losing friendship. Democratic states are constantly at war with non democratic states and therefore value unity more than equality, which leads to their implosion. Friends become soldiers who must sacrifice their lives for an unfounded law, following orders rather than deliberating free subjects. Since they constantly fear for their lives, they slowly value privacy rather than sharing, leading to more disagreements rather than agreements, and the rule of law becomes unnecessary. The return of the singular. However, as Derrida deconstruction usefully demonstrates, democracy can escape this militarist and tribalist fate. As the singularity of the citizens, their finitude is fundamental, and therefore they are always already open to love. Since two singularities cannot share anything and form agreements, before choosing between the friend and the enemy, they can respond to the call of love to love, or decide to love, as what love is for them is undecided. Moreover, I argue that the openness of love disjoins the law and justice, which is the possibility of making a just decision. Facing the finitude of the other shows that the law will never recognize all citizens, and therefore never be equal or right, which is the meaning of deciding justice. Democracy and the question of the friend. Throughout the politics of friendship, Derrida cites the aphorism, "All my friends, there are no friends," which Montaigne attributes to Aristotle and puzzled many political thinkers, and it puts into question the meaning of the friendship between the addresser and the addressee. As Derrida asks, how can the speaker address the friend without friends? Aristotle aphorism exemplify the call for democracy, which we can listen to according to Derrida when we fail to reconcile between singularity and universality, equality, or when we appeal to the law. There's no democracy without singularity, as each citizen's vote counts. At the same time, there cannot be a democracy without universality, as in democratic regimes, the majority counts, which requires abstracting singularities to representable subjects who are understood as equal. But as Derrida argues, in democracy, the singularity of the friend cannot be repressed for the sake of calculating votes or universalized for the sake of values of equality and equity. The singular is fundamental, is always poses questions we cannot answer. The opening of the immeasurable abyss between singularity and universality, the nothing, calls us to respond to democracy over and over again. Democracy does not exist, as it is an impossibility, which is the meaning of its possibility. The meaning of the impossibility of democracy, I argue, or democracy's call, is the wonder of the singular, which is why only in a democracy are citizens are completely open to love. Derrida argues that ideal love is supposed to be democratic, as its meaning is equality, but the opposite is true. In an autocracy, the rule of the one, the citizens appeal to an ideal love, love that posits the subject of love, the leader, instead of deciding to love the
Why is
other,
that, my love?
as it is in democracy, the rule of the many. As Derrida argues, Cicero's ideal love, hopeful love, one that eliminates the singularity of the beloved, is narcissistic. The lover and I are the same. but the beloved is an improved version of me. When lovers face each other's perfection, they actually desire their own perfection. Citizens in an autocratic regime desire immortality, autonomy. Nothing affects them, and therefore they cannot choose to love. On the other hand, in democracy, lovers are faced with the possibility that they will not love in return in the future when the lover passes away. They must constantly choose to love their alive and dead beloved or living ghosts. As Derrida mentions, for Aristotle, friendships consist of love, that is to say, an act before passion, before being situated, and before being loved. And this is how one knows love. And the more praised love is the love of the deceased, loving someone who cannot love you back. Being a subject without being an object of love is praiseworthy. But Derrida shows that the singularity of the other calls me to love. I'm not the subject of love, and the deceased beloved is not an object of my love. The death of the beloved is the limit, horizon of love, which is how love can be intelligible. But at the same time, loving the deceased and without this limitless love of an absent object, I could not have been able to sense myself loving. But the meaning of the unconditional decision to love is my finitude, which the beloved uncovers. Derrida alludes to this line of thought when he argues that with my death, I can no longer love the beloved, which is why the beloved takes away my possession over my death. As Derrida puts it, by loving the deceased, our deaths are intertwined. Only when the distinction between the subject and the object of love is broken, as it is the case when my finitude and the finitude of the other are intertwined, can I decide to love the beloved unconditionally. Facing the finitude through the finitude of the beloved means that in the future it will be impossible for me to love, which descenders love, as again, only by loving can I know love. What love is becomes unknown, and if love is unknown, I cannot stay autonomous and be responsible for my love. Instead, I'm called to love from a future which I cannot love anymore and hence cannot know love. My beloved constantly asks me, how is it possible that I love you? And I answer, I don't know. The impossibility of knowing what love is in advance means that I'm entirely responsible for my act of loving. As Derrida argued, a decision is unconscious. To be responsible, I have to face the other, the unknown in me, as only then is one absolutely open to decide. Derrida describes it as heteromonic social space in which we are responsible without being free, as our freedom opens from the other. Democracy to come is the meaning of love, which disrupts Schmittian decisionism, using the friend and the enemy distinction to justify the war that is so pervasive today. By facing the finitude of the other, I'm facing the impossibility of loving. I am turned into an object, the beloved, which cannot know love, and therefore cannot be responsible for choosing the beloved, as Schmidt's political actor is expected to, and thus identifying the enemy will be meaningless. In conclusion, their depolitization of democracy means opening citizens to love, which is the only possibility of justice in today's violent, deterritorial political world. Derrida calls it a bond between those who love in separation, an impossible community, which is the possibility of something new. Between the loss of the object of politics, of friendship, and the coming of the object of democracy, between the repressive past and the future that will never be a past, the undecided in loving the other is calling for our decision. Thank you.